Great. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on dealing with underperformance. Let's get the slides up and start sharing. And we can put this up here. So today we're going to be talking about that subject that everybody loves to hate, underperformance. And I'm going to be making a distinction between poor performance and underperformance and talk about the different ways in which you might want to challenge it. So first of all, for those of you who don't know anything about us, we specialize in all aspects of managing performance, not just dealing with underperformance, but lots of stuff around driving high performance and coaching and goal setting and rethinking the appraisal cycle and all of those things. This is a selection of our clients. As you can see, we primarily work with people who have promoted their managers because they are great technically, great professionally, great academically, but may not have brilliant people skills. So those tend to be the people that we work with. We deliver lots of training, but we also do lots of support and toolkits and guidance and work with HR teams in order to help them support their people directly. So lots of different ways in which we help you manage, improve, and drive high performance within your organization. So here's what I'm going to be thinking about. We need to get people to think about taking ownership of their performance. That is one of the key things about underperformance, and we're going to be talking about that early on. Then we're going to think about how you can develop your confidence by effectively preparing for difficult conversations, right? So we're going to talk quite a bit about preparation. Then I'm going to give you a simple toolkit that will start to help you unlock some of the performance issues you deal with, because they're not usually simple. And then finally, we'll have a short conversation guide at the end. So that's the plan for today. Okay, so I think it's worth saying that underperformers can often feel like the world's a hamster wheel. They can feel like no matter how hard they work, nothing ever seems to get any better. I put a lovely quote that I'm very fond of here from Alice in Wonderland about how we all seem to have to run faster and faster just to stand still. And when you deal with underperformance, what you're actually doing often is helping people, helping them reduce their stress and improve their well-being. And if you don't deal with it, you and your team will be running faster than ever just to stay still. So what is the difference here between underperformance and poor performance? I think it's worth just taking a moment to reflect, and you might want to think about how you use language in your organizations. So underperformance is where it's not terrible. You can't put your finger on something and go, oh God, absolutely, they shouldn't have done that. This is shocking. This is terrible. Why aren't they? You know, we need to deal with this person straight away. It's much more likely to be that things just aren't very good, but you can't quite put your finger on it. But somebody, for whatever reason, doesn't seem to be pulling their weight, or no matter how hard they try, they don't seem to be delivering the results that you want. Now, underperformance can afflict entire teams and entire populations. So we worked with one of the big local authorities where 70% of people were being rated as good or excellent in their annual performance reviews. And yet the organization was missing almost every KPI, almost every government target, almost every target they set themselves. In other words, there was widespread underperformance at the same time as people were individually being told that they're high performers. And that's a real challenge for you, because underperformers, because they work hard, because quite often they're willing, you feel very anxious about saying, but this isn't good enough. This isn't actually what I want. And part of the challenge is to understand what the real problem is. So we're going to have a look. So, oops, went the wrong way, forward. Okay, so you need to analyze the performance issue properly. Now, very simply, what needs to stop, what needs to start, what needs to change, what isn't clear. But the important thing for you is to sort out what is it that you want to be different, or if you're supporting a manager or a leader in any way who's frustrated about performance, they need to be clear about what they need to be different. And that's not the same as being frustrated with the person. Now, at this point, on the whole, I'm not talking about, you know, terrible behavior where you need to get somebody in a room and have a very demanding and tough conversation with them. Because in some ways, when things are really bad, it's actually quite clear what you have to do. It may not be very nice, but it's quite clear. What's really difficult is when it's not clear. And so we need to think about what are the dimensions of underperformance, which may, if not dealt with, lead to even worse poor performance, but think through that carefully. So here's a little model that I use. So there are fundamentally 3 dimensions to performance. One is the capability, how good people are at actually doing their job, what their technical skills are, what their toolkit is, how they're able to bring their experience to bear. Another is their work ethic. So though often some underperformers will be people who work hard but don't really get anywhere, there is another kind of underperformer who is perhaps lazy or always very slow or always a bit careless or who never really delivers their best work. And thirdly, there is the area of working relationships where, wittingly or not, somebody is undermining other people, being unhelpful. We might often talk about that as not being a team player. So the challenge on capability is quite interesting because there's often a thought, if capability is the problem, you know, a training solution will help. And I have been guilty of saying that myself. You know, if you've just got somebody who's lacking a bit of capability, you should be able to get a training solution. And obviously there are key moments when people miss out on vital training in their careers or things change. You know, we need digital transformation or organizational change needs new skills. And it's easy to say that a bit of training will deal with capability. But I'm sure that you are aware that that's often not the case. And it's not that somebody hasn't been on the course and doesn't know the stuff. It's that somehow they're not able to bring what their knowledge or their capability or their skills to address the real problem. So if you come to a capability issue, you need to think, what is it about the work that's not right? Right? Not just say, oh, they're not very good at spreadsheets, but what is it about the spreadsheets? Oh, you know, they're meant to be the project manager here, but they're not very good at project management. And yet putting them on a project management course doesn't change anything. So it's not really the knowledge, it's their ability to apply that knowledge. And that can be quite hard to really think through. So you need to analyze that quite carefully. Then you need to think about work ethic, and you need to separate in your own mind, what is somebody irritating you because their work ethic isn't the same as yours, or what is somebody whose work is suffering? So if someone is always late, but actually they get their work in on time, poor performance isn't really the problem, right? It may be the message they're sending to other people. It may be some other issue. But sometimes when people have different work ethics to us, what's irritating us is the difference in work ethic, not the actual problem with the work. So you need to be very clear, if it's a work ethic problem, what the problem actually is that you're trying to address. What do you want to be different? If people have got avoidance tactics going on, it's easy to assume that they're lazy or that they're difficult, right? And you need to unpick, if there are a lot of avoidance of certain issues going on, what's actually happening, and have that conversation. Before you tackle it as a performance issue, make sure that you understand it as what is driving that behavior. And then finally, if you've got working relationship problems, again, you need to think about, what do you want to be different in terms of what happens with the work? You don't have to like somebody. They don't have to suddenly become best mates to everyone, but you need to find a way that they can not allow their behavior to disrupt other people's working. So this is a helpful way of just thinking through what is the actual problem. Then you need to think through the person. So we've thought through the problem. Now we think through the person. And first of all, how is this person likely to react when you address their underperformance? And there are 3 broad ways in which people react. And some people do all 3 of these very fast or very slow or all at the same time. And so that's why it can sometimes feel confusing. So sometimes it's a relief that people know they're not really performing well. They know that things aren't right. They feel very uncertain. They might feel quite threatened by just the silence that surrounds them. And actually beginning to address the subject is a huge relief to them. They may still feel very surprised or very shocked or get very angry, but underneath there's a sense of relief. The second group are the people who are very surprised, and they're often the people who up till now have been told they're doing a good job. And many managers face this, don't they? Previous managers have not really tackled problems of underperformance or poor performance. And suddenly a new manager comes in and starts to tackle it and is met with, well, no one else has ever said that to me. You must be wrong, right? And that surprise can show itself in lots of ways: anger, hurt, shock, distress. If you're dealing with this person, the most important thing to do is allow time for somebody to have those initial reactions and you not to overreact, because you're prepared for this conversation. You thought it through, they're not. Therefore, in their surprise, they may do or behave or act in a way that they wouldn't normally. And your job is not to react to that, but just to let it happen and let it wash over you. And then the last thing that might happen is that you get to denial of somebody really, really continuing to say, no, that's not true. I'm a good performer. You're picking on me, or you don't understand, or I'm no worse than anybody else. And distracting you, essentially trying every way to avoid this conversation. Now, one of the ways in which it's easy to get distracted is if actually they're right that lots of other people are underperforming too, and you've got a lot of work to do. That's not a reason for not addressing it with them. So one of your preparation tactics will be to think, how am I going to deal with what might be typical denial or avoidance processes and still keep on the subject? And those of you who've been on our workshop around giving feedback will know that we very much encourage simple models like AIM, where you don't ask people what they think about the situation initially. You state the situation very clearly, talk about its impact, talk about what you would like to happen in the future, and then deal with some of the reactions, but be really clear. Now, lots of us have some of these things in our careers at different times, and sometimes we have all of these things at once. These are not wrong feelings, but they're just feelings, and you need to prepare how you will respond. All right, so how will you respond? We suggest that you think about how you're going to respond first, so that you don't bring your emotion into an underperformance meeting. So if you are feeling very cross with this person because they've caused you grief, because they're disrupting you, because you don't want to have to put yourself through this conversation, I hugely encourage you to write down how you feel about it, or make a voice memo. Just blurt it all out. My friend Fleur, my colleague Fleur, talks about, before you have any of these difficult conversations, just write down exactly how you feel about it and exactly what you would want to do if there were no boundaries of behavior around. And let that be parked. So write it all, think about it, and then park it and go, this is how I feel. I've got all my feelings out. If necessary, talk about it with a colleague or a trusted friend or somebody who you know will respect your confidentiality, and just deal with your feelings about the person or the meeting or the problem or all of those things together. And then make sure that you have parked mentally what you wrote, so that as you start any conversation, you remain aware of yourself and you aim to stay calm and neutral, because that is the best way that you can support this other person through the conversation. All right, so the next thing to get is some perspective. All right, is it me? Is it them? Is it both of us? So I've put up here a very simple little initial toolkit that you can use with some examples of how we might work. So you could use this. So you could do start, stop, continue, and you could look at the 3 categories of capability, work ethic, and relationships, and write in each box what it is that you're not happy with. So, for example, on this one, we put under work ethic that they're always late to meetings, and the example is that they're always late to the Monday morning team catch-up meeting. Now, all we've put there is what we've seen as a problem. We haven't yet talked about what the impact of that problem is, what the scale of it is, or anything else. So just remember, at this moment, we haven't, all we're trying to do at this stage is analyze what we think the actual problem is. And at this stage, what we put in is a behavior. We haven't said what the real problem is about them being late. So whenever you write things, and I put this in here, So we put a capability thing where they need to learn how to use a system properly, and they're given an example of not logging key data. Remember, if you were then going to give some feedback about that, you would then need to say the impact of this is, so that you can take what you see as the problem and turn it into an impact statement, but then they can understand what you're talking about. All right, so we go through that first bit about identifying what we see as the issues. And then you need to think, what can you do to understand the performance problem? So I've now picked up 3 things from the first toolkit and put them down here. So learn how to use the system properly, being late to meetings. And the third one that I didn't refer to was an example of blaming others. So first of all, have you given some basic feedback about the challenge, right? Just simply doing that. And what we can see is that in the third one, here's somebody who's always blaming other people. If we haven't given them any feedback about that, we're not even into a poor performance conversation yet. How can we be? We need to give them that basic feedback first, so to enable them to move on. Then think, have I really set some clear expectations? And I think there's quite an honest statement in this first block, which says, you know, have they learned how to use the system probably? And the question is, don't think they know why it's important and what it's for. So you need to challenge yourself. Have I really set clear expectations for performance? Am I sitting here frustrated about their performance, thinking, well, they should know what to do, they ought to know, it's their job? That's no good. You need to have given them some really clear expectations. And the only way that you know if you've done that is if they can tell you what your expectations are, what they understand of what's expected of them. Remember, the only real test for communication is if the other person has understood what you expect them to understand. So you can go through that. Then you might, in a conversation, want to sort out, are there any personal issues that are driving this? You know, so has something changed in the person's circumstances that's making the problems? And you may need to do some research, you may need to have a conversation, you may need to recognize that you don't know. And how are you going to find out? And then finally, give yourself some other perspectives. So you think this is a problem. Does anyone else think it's a problem? Is anyone else getting upset? Is it impacting anybody else? If it's not impacting anybody, you might want to ask yourself, is this really a problem, or is it just irritating me? Is it just their style that I don't like? But if you can get some other perspectives on the impact of the problem, it will prepare you to have the conversation. So all I talk about here, these whole last 3 slides have been very much about preparing to have the conversation. And often why poor performance conversations don't go well, underperformance doesn't go well, is because we don't do this prep. What we do is we go straight to this. So this is a model for a performance conversation. Is a model called Scope. There are others around, but it just allows you to think through. And so what we do is we go straight to preparing a Scope conversation. We go, oh, what's the situation, right? And we write down the situation as we see it without having been through any of that previous toolkit. We go into context, right? And here, if we're not careful, we go straight into our perspective of context. So I put really, really clearly here, we need to acknowledge any shortcomings of ourselves. So we need to be able to say, I'm aware that we haven't had a proper conversation about this before, or I'm aware that there have been a number of new members in the team and that has made some changes that have been difficult to deal with. So you need to, in preparing for a poor performance conversation, be conscious of your own contribution to the problem, and yet not let that detract from your need to deal with it with someone else. Options, sometimes it's very clear what you need someone to do, but very often it isn't. The thing about underperformance is, even when you're really clear about what the problem is, it's not always clear what the solution is. So yeah, if you're dealing with a straightforward, say, you know, a case of bullying, there can be some very clear, you need to stop behaving like this now, right? The very, very easy options, that is the option, that is the only option. But if you're dealing with somebody who's just not very good at their job, what are their options and their choices? And you might want to think through those very carefully. What real options are you giving them? You don't want to be setting them up to fail. You don't want to be setting them up with a task that you know they're going to fail at. so that then you can have a different conversation. That's not fair on you, that's not fair on them. You have to set them up with things that are deliverable, or have a conversation that says, I don't see how we're going to move on from here with you taking this set of responsibilities or requiring these sets of tasks. So you need to think through really what options are open to somebody. Then you might plan with them, agree what will happen next. And again, with underperformance, it is much more about how are we going to shift from things not being very good to things being acceptable to things being good? What is that shift? Give them a vision of what will be different and help them think about how they're going to get there. And then finally, agree the evaluation. Now, if you go straight to this without having done the earlier stuff, what happens is you end up with quite a weak conversation where you can be easily deflected, where you can be easily sidetracked into somebody changing the subject or trying to make you believe things aren't as bad as they were. And often where you end up at the end of it, not having agreed what you want to agree. So very clear, use this conversation structure, or if you have a similar model in your organization, only when you've done the initial preparatory work of properly analysing the situation. Okay, good, we're coming to the end. So if you want to know more about this, here's the book that was published last summer. It's got lots of conversation guides in, it's got these toolkits in a lot more detail, and it's been nominated for Best Business Book of the Year in Performance Management and Culture in the Business Book Awards, which is very, very encouraging. You can get it there. There is also tools in various other places. I can see that there's a little chat message gone in there. Oh, that's Helen putting up a note about the slides. And then finally, here we go. And Pearson have offered a discount to anybody attending the webinar. There is the discount. It will give you a 25% discount from the print book, and it lasts until the 16th of May, which is the date of the Business Book Awards.